5 games into the season, Texas gets a much-needed bye week before Red River next Saturday. What have we learned about the Texas Longhorns 5 games through the 2024 season?
You are Locked On Longhorns, your daily podcast on the Texas Longhorns. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Longhorns, the show. Jonathan Davis, your host. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, 10 things over the first 2 segments we have learned about the Texas Longhorns through the first 5 games of the regular season. Still 7 more to go, including Red River against Oklahoma next Saturday. And then in the last segment, Heisman candidates going into week 5 of the college football season. All of that and more on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So the hardest thing, and we got 2 of them now, but the hardest thing ever is to prep content going into a bye week, right? Especially when you're not coming off of like a huge win. Like if we were Alabama and we had just beat Georgia, you could talk about that every day going into the bye week because it's like you'll never get tired of talking about that. But we beat Mississippi State. You know what I mean? So it's like, do I just keep talking about Mississippi State all week and then transition into Oklahoma? No, of course not, right? So it's like, what do you talk about going into a bye week? Whatever's out there, right? So this is what we're going to talk about today. 10 things that we have learned, or I have learned, about the Texas football team through the first 5 games of the season, heading into the bye week, and then ultimately the biggest 2-game stretch of the season, or the regular season, I should say. You know, obviously the SEC championship and the playoffs will be a bigger 2-game stretch, but the biggest 2-game stretch of the regular season, Oklahoma in the Cotton Bowl, and then Georgia at home in DKR October 12th and October 9th. But Texas gets to rest up and gets a much-needed bye week before the 2 biggest games on their schedule. So what have I learned about this Texas football team through the first 2 weeks? We discussed that in the first 2 segments, but if you're watching on YouTube, you can see the GOAT, one of the Heisman winners at Texas, Ricky Williams, on the shirt, definitely repping today. Somebody told me I don't wear this shirt enough on Locked On Longhorns. You know what I mean? And it obviously is Longhorn related, so had to throw it on today. Shout out to them, all right, for sure. So here we go. 10 things I have learned about the Texas Longhorns through the first 5 games of the season. The first is this is a championship football team, right? I think coming into the season, we knew Texas was really good, right? We knew Texas was one of the best teams in the country, right? Then there was that couple of weeks where we felt like, okay, Texas is the best team in the country. And Texas may still be the best team in the country, but right now, Alabama has the number 1 spot, and they certainly deserve it after that huge win on Saturday night against the Georgia Bulldogs, right? But what we have learned over the first 5 weeks of the season is Texas certainly is a championship team, and this is a championship roster. Just the way that they're coached, the way that they're developed, the culture that emulates, from this Texas football team. Like, you see it, right? This is just a winning culture, right? A team with the attitude to go out there and dominate week in and week out. They have elite quarterback play, right? Elite weapons on the outside, an elite offensive line, and a defense that is playing at an amazing level, right? A turnover in all 5 games. You know, haven't got the sack numbers that we're accustomed to, even though they got a lot of sacks last week. But, you know, this is just a defense that's just been playing out of their minds, right? And so almost every level of this football team has been hitting on all cylinders through 5 weeks. So I think coming into the season, a lot of people thought this was a really good Texas team. They didn't necessarily know how we stacked up against some of the other elite teams in the country. We just thought Texas was one of the great teams, right? But this certainly is a championship team based on what we've seen. I keep repeating it. Joel Klatt said, if you want to win a championship this year, you're going to have to go through the Texas Longhorns. I think based on what we've seen through the first 5 weeks, Texas is on that short list of 3 or 4 teams that I think absolutely should be championship favorites right now. Of course, in the 12-team playoff, anything could happen. All 12 teams could win it, right? But I think when you look at the first 5 weeks, that body of work, Texas is in the top 2 or 3 teams that look like championship contenders right now. Second thing I've learned is that the ceiling of this football team is higher with Quinn Ewers, right? We all expect that Quinn Ewers will be healthy and back in the Red River rivalry against Oklahoma. We saw what happened last time. He took a couple weeks off and came back against Oklahoma. Texas won 49-0, right, in 2022. And when you look at it, Arch Manning has been absolutely exceptional, right? This has been great for Arch to, really get some, some snaps and some experience under his belt. And, in his first start wasn't great, through 2 interceptions, only completed about 52% of his passes, but he came back last week, this past Saturday against Mississippi State with a very strong performance, completing over 80% of his passes. I believe was the highest graded quarterback in college football this weekend. Arch Manning was just a spectacular performance against Mississippi State. And Arch Manning certainly can go out there and win you some games, right? That's why, Steve Sarkisian felt comfortable putting Quinn Ewers on the shelf for a couple of weeks and letting him rest up before the Oklahoma game. But what we've also seen from Arch Manning, which you see from a lot of young quarterbacks, is a lot of times locking on to his first read, right? Holding the ball too long, you know what I mean? Trying to make everything a big play, not taking the check down, things like that, missing on some of the easy throws, the short to intermediate throws, where Quinn Ewers has just become an absolute surgeon, right? Now, of course, we've seen the deep ball and deep passing game from Arch Manning, which is advanced, right? I think it's well beyond his years. I said he has an NFL deep ball already. But just in terms of operating this offense, the poise, right? The easy stuff, like I said, getting through the progressions of the offense, being able to move the ball down the field and consistently get yards and then put points on the board for this Texas offense. We've seen Quinn Ewers be able to do that, and I think Arch is still getting to that point. And we didn't see it from Quinn at a young age, right? It all comes with experience. Quinn Ewers said that coming back to college football around that 25th start is when you really start to see, quarterbacks in college take that next step. And even though all of these quarterbacks haven't taken 25 starts necessarily like Quinn has, we've seen that. Or a guy like, Jackson Dart, who's really taken that next step. Jalen Milroe, Carson Beck, Cam Ward. The best quarterbacks in college football right now are the ones that have been around, right? They have that experience and they're balling. So I think we've seen a lot of promise from the young quarterback and Arch Manning. But I think we all can agree as Texas fans that the ceiling of this football team is just a little bit higher right now with Quinn Ewers, right? Will Arch Manning eventually be better than Quinn Ewers down the road? Who knows, right? It's all beneficial to the University of Texas, right? But at this moment, as we look at it through 5 games, I believe the ceiling of this football team is higher with Quinn Ewers currently than it is with Arch Manning. As great as Arch Manning has been the last 2.5 games in relief of Quinn Ewers. The third thing is losing Jonathan Brooks and Cedric Baxter has predictably hurt this running game, right? You look at it and you replace Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson and Keelan Robinson and Jonathan Brooks, and you keep bringing in elite running backs. But it's hard to continue to do that time after time after time. But you're coming into the season expecting a rotation of Cedric Baxter and Jaden Blue, then maybe with, Jared Gibson, Trey Wisner, or Christian Clark as your change of pace back. But then you lose Cedric Baxter, which is a huge loss after just losing Jonathan Brooks, the last 1,000-yard rusher at the University of Texas, to the National Football League. And then, you lose Christian Clark as well. And so you go into the season with a rotation of Jared Gibson, Trey Wisner, and Jaden Blue. And I think that rotation has been good, but we're used to seeing great to exceptional running back play at the University of Texas. And I would not say through the first 5 games, we've seen great to exceptional running back play at the University of Texas. I think it's just been good, right? I think Trey Wisner has been all right, averaging, less than 4 yards a carry coming into the Mississippi State game. He was able to make some big plays. I think Jared Gibson has been better than you would expect as a true freshman, but he's kind of tailed off the last couple of games. And then obviously Jaden Blue getting benched in the Mississippi State game with 2 fumbles on 6 carries. The running back rotation has been good. And I think Steve Sarkisian has been able to supplement the running game in other ways, with a couple rushing touchdowns from Isaiah Bond, 55-yard run from Ryan Wingo, 67-yard run from Arch Manning. So you've been able to pick up the slack in other places. And, of course, the passing game has just been on fire. But we're used to exceptional play from our running backs, elite play. We've seen probably good play the first 5 games through our running backs. That's going to have to pick up through the rest of the season when you got teams like Oklahoma and Georgia coming up on the schedule. But you lose running backs like Jonathan Brooks to the NFL and then Cedric Baxter to injury. Predictably, we thought this running game would take a hit, and so far, at least from the running backs, it has. We have, this is the 4th thing, 5 wide receivers that can take over the game at any point, possibly 6, right? I've been super impressed with what Isaiah Bond has brought to this team as a number one wide receiver. Matthew Golden coming over from Houston, not flashy, but just consistent, just solid. You throw the ball, in his catch radius, he's going to make a play. I don't think he's gone over 100 yards, this year yet. Had a couple 2-touchdown games, but he's just been a solid, reliable number 2 for Quinn Ewers. I think Ryan Wingo has been all world as a true freshman. We heard about him all off season. I think even thus far, he's been better than advertised. Jonte Cook, right? We expected him to be a bigger part of the rotation coming into the season, but when he's got his opportunities outside of Saturday, missing that perfect deep ball from Arch Manning, he's been really good. And then we internet kicked out on me a little bit, so I had to pause it. But I just talked about how Jonte Cook, when he's got his opportunities outside of the big play on Saturday, he's been great. And then DeAndre Moore finally had his breakout game with the 4 catches for over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns, was a step away from having 3 touchdowns. So 5 wide receivers that have all had huge imprints on the games thus far. One of the biggest reasons why Texas is the number 2 team in the country, 5-0 up until this point. We expected Silas Bolden to be a bigger part of the rotation. Maybe that's coming. He hasn't done a ton in the receiving game thus far. So I would say we have 5 just game changers, wide receivers that could be the best player on the field at any moment. And I'm sure Silas Bolden will be incorporated more into the offense as the season goes along. And he's, one missed tackle or one broken tackle away from taking anything to the house as well. So coming into the season, we knew we had 6 dynamic wide receivers, and we've seen great plays from 5 of them, great games from 5 of them. And I believe 6 is on the way for Silas Bolden. And then the last thing before we get into the break, continuity on the offensive line matters. We brought back 4 out of 5 starters from last year, over 100 starts on the offensive line. And you've really seen the benefit of that, right? You see a lot of teams that replace their entire offensive line, Oklahoma, right? And they look like a shell of themselves because of it. And then you see a team, and Michigan, right? Even though Michigan has picked it up since they lost to Texas. But then you see a team like Texas with all that continuity on the offensive line, and they're just moving people in the running game and then blocking their asses off for Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning. And a perfect example of that is that game that they put together on Saturday. The offensive line, outside of the penalties, was just phenomenal, right? So one of the biggest reasons that Texas is a championship contender is because they can absolutely control the line of scrimmage with that offensive line, and bringing back 4 or 5 starters. And Cam Williams, even outside of the penalties, he's been really good. The continuity they have on the offensive line, along with the development from offensive line coach Kyle Flood, is one of the biggest reasons that Texas is one of the best teams in the country, because this offensive line, from Kelvin Banks to Hayden Connor, Jake Majors, Devon Campbell, they are stalwarts, and they are playing at an elite level through the first 5 weeks of the season, just moving people in the trenches, giving Texas the push they need up front to dominate teams at the line of scrimmage week in and week out. Quick word from our sponsors, and then 5 more things I've learned about this Texas football team through the first 5 weeks of the season. All right, today's episode of Locked On Longhorns brought to you by Return on You. It's time to highlight my Return on You Player of the Week, or Roy. Roy is a new platform that lets fans make contributions directly to their favorite athletes. Download Roy for iOS or Android and enter referral code Locked On, and you'll automatically be entered into a sweepstakes to win $5,000 cash. No purchase necessary, void where prohibited. Excuse me. This week we've selected Colin Simmons, right? That game that he had on Saturday. Just the true freshman from Duncanville, continuing to make highlight plays, splash plays. We thought coming into the University of Texas, he could potentially be one of the best edge rushers to ever put on the burnt orange and white. And he's made a very strong statement through the first 5 weeks. Already 4 sacks. If you were impressed with his performance on Saturday, if you were as impressed with his performance as I was on Saturday, you can show him some love too. Just hop on Roy, Return on You, and throw in a few bucks. If everyone pitches in just $10, it adds up really fast for Colin Simmons. Now you have the chance to show your appreciation for Colin and his standout performance this week, as well as what he'll continue to bring to the Texas Longhorns program. So get off the sidelines and into the NIL game with Roy, or Return on You. Boys making some big NIL money, right? But you hop on, Return on You or Roy, and contribute to that for sure. So the next one is, this is a ball hawking defense. I talked about it on Monday's episode, or the last episode I did on Locked On Longhorns with Tony from Spot on Sports. But this is a defense that at times going to give up yards, right? We've already seen it in the running game, and Mississippi State certainly had some opportunities to get down the field in the passing game. We'll have to see, what Oklahoma can do on offense with the new true freshman quarterback, and Michael Hawkins, and how much they can really stretch the field, with all of their wide receivers being hurt at this point. But we certainly saw in the second half of that game in, a shootout between Carson Beck and Jalen Milroe, that Carson Beck can air it out, right? Especially when the game's on the line and he can make some big plays. Those receivers can make some big plays. And so you're going to have to clean that up. But, any defense is going to give up yards at times. But I think the sign of a great defense, elite defense, is splash plays and turnovers, right? And we haven't had the sacks, the amount of sacks that we thought were coming into the season. Trey Moore still doesn't have a sack up until this point, which I think is absolutely crazy through 5 weeks. We'll have to see what happens through the remainder of the season, but he's been playing good ball, getting some good pressure. Nonetheless, what they have done is force a turnover in all 5 games, right? And now the games haven't necessarily been close. You probably would have won all 5 of these games without a turnover, but what that's done has given more opportunities to our offense, right? And when you put Steve Sarkisian's offense on the field for more opportunities, they're going to strike, right? And so elite defenses take the ball away and give the ball back to their offenses in advantageous situations. That's exactly what this defense has done for 5 straight games to start the season. And oh yeah, you're playing against another true freshman quarterback in your next game in Oklahoma. Just played against one in Mississippi State and Michael Van Buren, who gave up one on a sack fumble. So I look for them to do the same thing in the Red River rivalry, right? One of the biggest games of the season. Every season, especially for the Texas Longhorns, but just in college football, period, you're going to have to force Michael Hawkins into some turnovers to make sure you walk out of the Cotton Bowl with a victory. So ball hawking defense, once again, 5 straight games with the turnover from this defense. That's what elite defenses do, right? Once again, take the ball away from opposing offenses and put your offense in advantageous situations to put more points on the board and ultimately walk out of the building with a victory. Colin Simmons, right? I just talked about him. Throw him some, more NIL money through return on you through Roy. I'm giving him a little bit more, advertising time than they paid for today, but it's all good, right? So Colin Simmons, just phenomenal. I remember when he committed, before he committed, right? One of the best players ever to come out of Duncanville, and we just had to get him in a Texas jersey. It felt for a long time, felt like for a long time that he could be headed to, LSU. And his former teammate, Durham, the running back, is going crazy at LSU right now. And we had to pry him away from LSU. Right? We were able to get him at the University of Texas. And when he committed, just a big day for all Texas fans. It wasn't as big as when Arch committed, but it kind of felt like that, right? Like one of those Arch Manning type players. And, immediately the conversation after a player like Colin Simmons commits is he could be the best edge rusher at the University of Texas since, or he could be the best edge rusher, period, to ever come through the University of Texas. He could be the next first round pick off the defensive line at the University of Texas, or the first defensive lineman or edge rusher to go in the first round from the University of Texas since, right? It was all of these lofty expectations put on a kid that committed to the University of Texas while he was still in high school, because we saw what he was doing at Duncanville, right? And he didn't, play too much in the first week or, too many meaningful snaps. But since then, certainly since the Michigan game and really last week where Tony told you he played 41 of 75 snaps, he has absolutely come on and been dominant for this football team. 4 sacks in 5 games already. And when I watched that Mississippi State game, he looked like he was at Duncanville damn near. Just making plays effortlessly, just a spectacular, I don't want to say generational talent, right? That word, that phrase probably gets thrown around a little bit too much, but just a once in a lifetime. It's probably the same thing as generational. So I guess I just said it. Talent. They just don't grow on trees. Colin Simmons is an absolute man amongst boys, and we get him the rest of this year and then 2 more years at the 40 acres. But he's already making plays like he's been here for 3 years. Just a phenomenal player. Colin Simmons, like I said, making it look easy like he's still at Duncanville. So glad he ended up in the burnt orange and white. That is a ball player. Jahdae Barron can play anywhere on this defense. One of the questions coming into the season was how seamlessly could he make the transition from nickel to outside corner. Very seamless, right? He's been elite at outside corner while allowing Jalen Gilbo to play in that slot position. And Jalen Gilbo has been really good at the corner position as well. All 3 of them, Malik Muhammad, right? You haven't heard his name a lot. That means he hasn't given up any big plays, right? So all 3 of the corners have been great, but the storyline coming into the season was how would that transition look from the star position to the outside corner position for Jahdae Barron. And he's been one of the best corners in the country since making that transition to the outside. Certainly made himself a lot of money thus far through the first 5 games. He's going to be one of the highest drafted defensive backs in the NFL draft when that time comes. Next one is Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy can't be replaced, right? And this is no disrespect, I say this all the time. This is no disrespect to, Alfred Collins, Vernon Broughton, Jermaine Lole, Tia Savea, Bill Norton, anybody else, right? It's just a testament to how good, how elite Byron Murphy and Tavondre Sweat were at those positions, right? We've had good play from our defensive tackles. They haven't been slouches, Alfred Collins, Vernon Broughton, and them. But last year, we were seeing splash plays, elite plays, just disruptiveness, play in and play out, snap in and snap out from Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy. And we haven't necessarily seen that from our defensive tackles thus far this year, but they're just not Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy. So, people always talk about if you could add one former Longhorn to this team, who would it? I mean, I think I would start with, maybe at the running back position right now, I'd probably add an old running back, Bijan Robinson or Jonathan Brooks or something like that. But then the next, place I would look is that defensive tackle position, adding Tavondre Sweat or Byron Murphy. Just two absolute dogs that we had that led us to having a, top 3 run defense in the country last year. We've had good play from our defensive tackles, but you just can't replace guys like Byron Murphy and Tavondre Sweat. And we haven't been able to thus far, even with good to solid play from our defensive tackles. And then I want to talk about the veteran leadership, right? Veteran leadership is carrying this team on the field and in the locker room, right? When you look at guys who have been here forever, they are balling, right? But also help setting the culture, right? Also help leading this locker room, but also still going out there and playing at a very high level on the field. Jake Majors, right? David Benda, Michael Taft, Jade Barron, players like that have been at the University of Texas forever, right? Not only balling on the field, helping setting that culture for Steve Sarkisian and being some of the biggest voices in the locker room. So we got some old, 23, 24-year-old players at the University of Texas still doing their thing, but that veteran leadership they're bringing is really helping this team as a whole. And like I said, they're still playing at a high level on the field, helping Texas to the number 2 ranking in the country and a 5-0 start in consecutive years for the first time. And I don't know. Let me not say nothing I haven't researched, right? But yeah, the veteran leadership on the field and in the locker room is one of the biggest reasons that Texas is the number 2 team in the country and 5-0 up until this point. So those are 10 things that I have learned about the Texas football team through the first 5 weeks. If I missed anything, if you've learned anything different, please let me know in the comments. A quick word from our sponsors, and then we get into the Heisman rankings going into week 6 of the college football season. Today's episode of Locked on Longhorns is also brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Place your bets today. All right, my Heisman rankings, my top 5 going into week 6. I'm going with Dylan Sampson, number 5 from Tennessee, coming off a bye week. The numbers aren't super flashy in terms of the total yards, but they have only played 4 games, so 519 total yards, averaging over 100 yards per game from scrimmage, right? The number 4 team in the country. He's been one of the biggest reasons why. Obviously, we know about the defense, players like James Pierce. We know about the young quarterback, Nico Iamaleava. But Josh Heupel wants to run the ball, and Dylan Sampson has done just that for the Tennessee Volunteers. Once again, number 4 team in the country, and we know that matters in the Heisman rankings. 519 total yards and 10 touchdowns through just 4 games for the Tennessee Volunteers. Dylan Sampson been one of the best running backs in the country. He comes in even after a bye at number 5 on my list in terms of Heisman candidates going into next week. Cam Ward. It got shaky a little bit when Miami almost lost to Virginia Tech. And one of the reasons that Miami also almost lost to Virginia Tech was 2 interceptions by Cam Ward. So he had been number 1 on my list pretty much every week. Knocked him down to number 4. Very close call with Virginia Tech. And like I said, he threw 2 bad interceptions in that game. So I got to dock him. But still, been one of the best players in the country, period, bar none. And Miami is still undefeated. College game day next week at Cal when Miami travels all the way across the country to face them. Gotta love college realignment, right? 1,928 conference realignment, I should say. 1,928 total yards and 20 touchdowns on the season for Cam Ward. So like I said, Miami did have a scare, but make no mistake about it, Cam Ward has still been one of the best players in the country. making his debut on my Heisman rankings, and he probably should have been there, right? I'm kind of somewhat of a hype beast, even though I did watch the Oregon game because I had money on it. Ashton Jeanty, 864 total yards and 13 touchdowns. Are you kidding me? From the running back position, 864 total yards and 13 touchdowns going into week 6. I mean, can you even do that in NCAA 25 on like the hardest ranking? I mean, he is putting up video game numbers. I saw something on Prize Picks the other day. His line was set at 170 yards. His over under was set at 170 yards. And Boise State's only lost to Oregon. I mean, Ashton Jeanty, good Lord. I heard the Cowboys need a running back. I mean, he in blue right now. It's a different type of blue for Boise State. I hope he can be a Cowboy blue next year. Good Lord. 864 total yards and 13 touchdowns, averaging 10 yards a carry. Goodness. Number 2, I got Travis Hunter, 561 yards receiving and 6 touchdowns. Also 16 tackles and 3 turnovers forced on the defensive side of the ball. Just an elite two-way player doing things we've rarely ever seen in college football, period. And we've been watching college football for a long, long time, over 100 years, man. And don't look now, but Colorado is 4-1. I said they would be 8-4. People said I was crazy. I don't know if they'll be 8-4, but they're 4-1 right now. And they got a really big game this weekend against Kansas State. But nonetheless, Travis Hunter, one of the best players in the country. He's been playing like it at an elite level on offense and defense. Travis Hunter, number 2 in my Heisman rankings, and then number 1, because we know it matters, right? Number 1 team in the country, huge win in the biggest game of the season. He's also putting up video game numbers. Former Texas commit, Texas boy Jalen Milroe, got him at number 1 in my Heisman rankings going into next week for the number 1 Alabama Crimson Tide QB1. 1,237 total yards through just 4 games and 18 touchdowns with only 1 turnover. And he was phenomenal in Saturday night's game against the Georgia Bulldogs. So I got Jalen Milroe, number 1 in my Heisman rankings right now going into week 6. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hook 'em. Peace. Run, Ricky, run.